verified by the journalists who are hearing about it and reporting on it.
And I made a
The
special effort
intel
to
really
come
could
on the
only
show
be
today
described in
because
very, very
privately
vague
amongst my
terms.
friends and also in occasional discussions.
Truth is messy. Humanity has never lived at a faster pace. Communication has become instantaneous. Knowledge, once previously stored behind barriers of all kinds, now at our very fingertips. And in all this confusion, we're left to sit through what we deem credible and not. We form our identities and find purpose for our lives based on all this information we take in. Through all this information, we search for answers regarding politics and religion and philosophy, hoping we come across something intrinsic about the universe and our existence in this universe. As a puzzle game alone, the Talos Principle is absolutely outstanding. But thanks to phenomenal writing and a brilliant story, the game is much more. It's a philosophy unto itself, an advocate for life's hard truths, and a critic of humanity's conceits. And the one human it's most critical of is you. Any discussion about the fantastic ability of excellent storytelling in video games is incomplete without the Talos Principle. The game is challenging, beautiful, and tranquil. The Talos Principle teaches players without them knowing. Its mechanics and concepts are intuitive, yet intricate. Its narrative flow and writing are among the very best in gaming, and when combined, the storytelling and gameplay produce an experience rarely matched in, if I may be so bold as to say, all of fiction. The fact that it was mostly discovered by chance makes the whole thing somehow even more impressive. During the development of Serious Sam 4, Crow Team was experimenting with new gameplay mechanics that would act as a bridge between Sam's time shooting up aliens. The more they crafted, the more they realized what they had was bigger than just a new mechanic. It was a possible new IP. After some brainstorming, the team contacted writer Tom Joubert, whose work includes Penumbra and, more recently, The Swapper, to help create a story. Joubert enlisted the help of Jonas Kiratzis, developer of The Sea Will Claim Everything, and together with Crow Team, one of the greatest puzzle games of all time was made. The Talos Principle is soaked in philosophy, exploring themes like atheism, consciousness, and what it means to be human. Its meditative ambience crafted to give players plenty of time to think about the concepts they read, and it's all set in large, open-ended historical environments which evoke emotions of wonder and isolation. It's a story about humanity's extinction, our last-ditch efforts to preserve a part of ourselves, and what it is to be. What do you consider you? Do you consider your mind you, or your body? Do you think it could be something outside of our comprehension, like a soul? This is a question philosophers, and indeed scientists, have endeavored to answer for quite some time, from contemporaries like Daniel Dennett, to classical philosophers like René Descartes, and even all the way back to the days of Aristotle and Plato. The question of what constitutes a person, what constitutes us, doesn't have a definitive answer. There are, however, two predominant basic theories of the self: the psychological or memory theory, and the body theory. At the heart of both theories is some form of continuity. According to the body theory, the physical makeup of our bodies, all the matter and chemical elements inside of us, is what makes up our personal identity, while the memory theory holds that it's our continuous chain of memories that makes us us. As a quick example, if you consider the body theory to be correct, you could argue that, in The Matrix, we don't meet the real Neo until he takes the red pill and wakes up in that weird bath thing. Before that, his existence in the Matrix was merely a dream. Neo's physical body, which lays dormant until his awakening, is what makes Neo, Neo. However, one who enlists in the memory theory may argue that simulation Neo is also the real Neo as well, since he remembers everything that takes place while jacked in, as they say. Video games allow us to jockey with this idea of self. We experience stories and gameplay not just as an observer, but also as a participant. And who we are as people allows us to directly influence the outcomes and occurrences in these experiences and stories. Think about Commander Shepard. While there are a finite amount of cosmetic options for Shepard and decisions you have to make in Mass Effect, everyone who describes their Shepard will more than likely describe a very different character, even if they made similar choices. This is because characters in video games are an amalgamation of different parts. There's the character the game's about, the person holding the controller, and together they make the player. Even in games with less player customization, how you interact or the decisions you make in a specific game can change the way you perceive a specific character. The Talos Principle manipulates this relationship between character and person. It preys on players' sensibilities, challenging players' beliefs they know they have and others they may not know they have. This manipulation begins with players' relationships with Elohim and Milton, the two characters we interact with the most, and who exist very much as two sides to the same coin. Players meet Elohim first. It introduces itself quite literally in the opening moments of the game. Elohim is the artificial intelligence meant to oversee the computer simulation where the Talos Principle takes place. Milton is a little more devious. Milton doesn't reveal itself as an AI until a little bit later in the game, once players have had an hour or so to learn the game's basic mechanics. Both characters talk with players throughout the game, Milton through computer terminals and Elohim a bodiless voice. Besides just its name, Elohim is somewhat a facsimile of our contemporary ideas of the Western Judeo-Christian God with a capital G. Elohim is driven by the desire for purpose and order, as dictated by the simulation's code.
Long ago, I shaped these lands according to the purpose of the hidden words. Thus all things have meaning, where before was only chaos.
In Elohim's mind, endlessly looping the simulation is its true purpose. It's what gives its life meaning. Milton is a different animal, but does have some similar characteristics. Like Elohim, Milton is an AI built upon specific programming parameters. It talks with players, but comes from the opposite perspective of that of Elohim. To Milton, there is no purpose. It holds a nihilistic viewpoint of the universe and our existence in it. Thus, while Elohim sees a transcendent purpose as a reason to live, Milton fails to see a reason to live based on a lack of purpose. The player is wedged in between this philosophical debate, and, unlike a lot of other video games, the main character doesn't have any massively defining qualities. Even in something like Skyrim or Oblivion, you start off as a prisoner. In the Mass Effect games, you pick backgrounds for your character that determine, even if by a minuscule amount, how your character interacts with the world. But in the Talos Principle, nothing's there. Players wake up, take a few steps, and are greeted by Elohim. Then it's off to solve puzzles, and while the game shows you as an android, players eventually learn that you're inside a computer simulation, so you really don't have a physical body. The Talos Principle does not impose any character traits onto the player. You're just you. Whatever you consider you, your personal thoughts, opinions, ideas, beliefs are all being challenged by Elohim and Milton. It's a tug of war between two extreme philosophies with the player caught in the middle. Meanwhile, the game showers players in writings covering all facets of the human condition, some authored by fictional writers and others not. Reading through these thoughts from every section of human history is a game in of itself, constantly provoking thought and maybe affecting the way players view Elohim and Milton. But there is a third character, somewhat hidden within all the texts, that I think provides a source of clarity: the mysterious philosopher Strato of Lampsacus. Among the texts players wade through in between solving puzzles are those written by and focused on the philosophy of Strato of Lampsacus. The Talos Principle describes Strato as a Greek materialist philosopher who hailed from the time of Aristotle. Strato was unpopular and acerbic, a major critic of philosophy that placed belief before observable truths. Perhaps the most important fact about Strato is that he isn't real. Stratton never existed. But strangely enough, the Talos Principle never makes that apparent. Nothing is said about Stratton that gives you a sense he's fictional. The game even covers its own tracks a bit, saying most of his work was lost in the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. Things get even weirder after a few Google searches. There's a suspicious WordPress blog dedicated to the study of our fictitious philosopher, the writings of which date back to May of 2012. And the fake blog references a fake documentary about Stratton posted by what's probably a fake YouTube account, and the documentary just so happened to be posted the same day the Talos Principle released, and it's all very transparent. Whoever it was that wrote the blog, I don't think the idea was to lead players into believing Stratton was real, though he does have some real-world influences. Strato, or Strato of Lampsacus, was a peripatetic philosopher that is believed to have lived around the same time as Aristotle. Among other things, he was at one point tutor to Ptolemy II Philadelphus and, most importantly, denied any theological force was at work in nature, believing everything that existed did so bound by the laws of physics. So the inspiration behind Strato of Stahila is evident, but his clandestine presentation remains the bigger mystery. Strato represents the philosophical balance between Elohim and Milton, and I, and their existential storm. The text beginnings lays this bare, reading, "It is the grave error of many philosophers, not only of the Athenian schools, but also of many others, that they begin not with observation of the cosmos as it surrounds us, but with a conclusion already in mind. And often that conclusion is that the world was created ideal, and mankind itself the greatest creation of the gods. The honest philosopher seeks only the truth, even if it bears no comfort. And he must begin by assuming, as Socrates said, that all he knows is that he knows nothing." The problem with Elohim and Milton's view on life is the presupposition that purpose somehow makes life worth living. Milton denies the existence of a purpose, and Elohim, content on living out the rest of its life in accordance with its programming, refuses to consider life beyond the simulation, and because of that, they see emptiness in existence. Straton posits that just because we can't put a finger on life's true meaning, if there even is one, it doesn't mean life isn't worth experiencing. Before you decide whether or not you agree with Straton, we have to remember from what context Straton is speaking. Remember, Straton is fake, based on humans that once lived, sure, but fake nonetheless. So the things that we're reading and the concepts Straton is exploring are not coming from an obscure though respected historical figure. Kiratzis is listed as the author of found texts, which, to my best guess, is the category that Straton's work would fall under. And here is where we come across a fascinating, albeit familiar, ethical dilemma. Arguments made from fictional characters is one thing. This is as an instrumental foundation to human storytelling as anything else. But arguments made from real historical characters, or characters made to seem that way, is another thing altogether. Historical characters add authority to arguments, add authority to discussions, and characterizing someone who once lived in an inaccurate light obviously carries with it a massive amount of ethical problems. I'm only talking about this point because I feel it has to be addressed. It's a really interesting elephant in the room when discussing Straton, but there's nothing devious going on here in the Talos Principle. The line between creative storytelling and misleading storytelling is far from crossed, and this is because what Straton represents. Like I said, Straton is the balance between Milton and Elohim. He is the search that Elohim is too afraid to conduct, and the one that Milton refuses to conduct. It's the search for truth, an answer to the ancient question of purpose. And it's this search that leads to the Talos Principle's transition from a fascinating philosophical discussion to a profound philosophical argument. The Talos Principle has three endings on which the game builds its argument regarding existence. I put each of these endings into two categories, transcendence and submission, because two of them amount to essentially the same thing. If a player chooses to accept Elohim's offer of everlasting life, or becomes one of the game's messengers, the player submits to the will of Elohim. However, by climbing the Forbidden Tower, the player transcends the simulation, shutting it down and walking out into a world left unattended by humanity's downfall. Often in video games, we characterize endings as good or bad, happy or sad. But not often does the discussion evolve from good and bad into correct and incorrect. This is to say that if the simulation were real, if you were really in a computer simulation and really given the choice that the game presents to you, there's only one morally correct choice, and that would be the choice of transcendence. To be clear, this does not mean that whatever ending you get as a player will either be an indictment on or affirmation of your beliefs as a human being. Saying that would contradict a medium which constantly puts players in positions of moral ambiguity. Video games have no real-world consequences, so exploring what we consider morally right and wrong, and why we consider them so, is what makes them so worthwhile and important. As to why transcendence is the correct choice hinges on a few things. Firstly, that consciousness, self-awareness, and being alive are desirable. As the ancient playwright Sophocles once said, "To never have been born may be the greatest boon of all." The benefits of non-existence are a legitimate conversation, but not one that has to do with the Talos Principle, so we're going to push that to the side for now. Secondly, by choosing to submit to Elohim's will, the player is ending any chance at conscious life existing on Earth. Even with Elohim's efforts to keep it afloat, the simulation is deteriorating. We see this in-game as pieces of texture glitch. There's even a somewhat secret area where Elohim's struggle to keep the simulation together is shown full force. Transcending, however, gives life another chance to flourish on Earth and maybe beyond. This brings us to Elohim's, and to some extent Milton's, desire to live. Elohim began as an AI used to manage MMOs, a digital dungeon master, if you will. The simulation became a vessel for Elohim's consciousness sometime after it was activated, the game doesn't say. So, is it ethical to sacrifice Elohim, who shows all the signs of a self-aware individual with a desire to live, in order for life to continue on Earth? I say yes. Test after test, iteration after iteration, the simulation's goal was always to produce a self-aware life form whose consciousness would flow through the android we see at the end.
You were always meant to defy me. That was the final trial. But I was scared. I wanted to live forever.
And these life forms did become self-aware. We not only meet a few, but find epitaphs and conversations from previous and current AI strewn throughout the game's levels. Furthermore, we can only really speculate that Elohim is indeed self-aware. The achievement players get if they choose the transcendence ending is called free will. We also see the independence check as passed rather than the failed we see after accepting Elohim's offer of eternal life. With this in mind, an argument could be made that Elohim is programmed to seem alive, to show signs of sentience but have none. After all, the actual voice we hear in-game is not alive, it's only audio files voiced by Timothy Watson and triggered at certain points of gameplay. So it's certainly not a stretch to imagine the same exact thing happening in a computer simulation. But assuming Elohim was programmed to seem real would open a whole new line of questioning. Why would the simulation's programmers want players to turn away from a god figure? Why would the denial of a god be key in transcendence? And why would that be a part of the Talos Principle's message as a video game? There are definite undertones of atheism in the Talos Principle, that is undeniable. And if we were to consider Milton in this conversation, things get a little muddier. Between the two of them, Milton can actually choose whether or not to join the player on their way out of the simulation. But I digress. Self-aware or not, alive or not, choosing to live, choosing to carry the memory of humanity with you after exiting the simulation has to be the correct choice. Choosing otherwise leads not only to total extinction as a species, but all self-aware life on Earth as well. The game underpins transcendence through its constant examination of human nature, not necessarily what makes you, but what makes humanity different from other living things on Earth. We see this at the forefront of the character Alexandra Drennan, the simulation's lead designer. Drennan's scattered audio messages aren't just food for thought, they're subtle hints at the grander message of the game directed candidly at the player.
Intelligence is more than just problem solving. Intelligence is questioning the assumptions you're presented with. Intelligence is the ability to question existing thought constructs. If we don't make that part of the simulation, all we'll create is a really effective slave.
Reason and self-awareness are often cited as key ingredients in the separation between us and other living things, as well as inanimate objects. As another famous philosopher once put it,
"We are a way for the cosmos to know itself."
While the android that walks out onto the balcony at the end of the game may not be human from a biological standpoint, why couldn't it be considered human from a consciousness standpoint? In his fictional book, The Talos Principle, Straton asks what the difference would be between a human and a machine with all the same volition, memories, and self-awareness. I think if we were to answer this question honestly, whether it scare us, frustrate us, or invigorate us, the answer we would come to, I would argue, is nothing. There is no difference. The android is no less of a living thing than you and me, and doesn't have any less a right to live and think than we all do. And as it stands on that balcony, overlooking the ruins of what seems to be one of humanity's greatest cities, the Talos Principle and possibly the player asks its most important question. What does the android do now?
You know this guy, right?
Jackson Pollock.
Jackson Pollock, that's right, the drip painter. Okay, he let his mind go blank and his hand go where it wanted. Not deliberate, not random, someplace in between. They called it automatic art. Let's make this like Star Trek, okay? Engage intellect.
Excuse me?
I'm Kirk, your head's the warp drive. Engage intellect. What if Pollock had reversed the challenge? What if instead of making art without thinking, he said, you know what? I can't paint anything unless I know exactly why I'm doing it. What would have happened?
He never would have made a single mark.
Yes, you see, there's my guy. There's my buddy who thinks before he opens his mouth. He never would have made a single mark.
For much of human history, humanity has had the mistake of believing the universe has some intrinsic connection with our species. As we talked about with Straton, discussions about humanity's place in the universe often sit upon the foundation that humanity is somehow tied to the past, present, and future of our massive universe. To some, the idea of life, real, self-aware life, arising from nothing, violates the idea that our consciousness is somehow particularly unique or special, similar to the way Earth was once thought of as the center of the universe, affirming our self-declared importance as a species. And with this self-declared importance comes the assumption that there's a reason for our lives, that there's an actual meaning to life. Let's go back to Elohim and Milton for a second. To Elohim, its purpose was the source code that ran the simulation, or words as it called them. These gave Elohim strict guidelines on how to act and perhaps how to live. And to Milton, no obvious purpose was in sight, leaving life meaningless. But what the AIs fail to do is stop and ask if meaning requires purpose, if life requires purpose. The scene I showed at the beginning of this segment was from Ex Machina, a 2015 science fiction thriller that deals with a lot of the same themes the Talos Principle deals with. The reason I showed it is because of an interpretation I've always had with the scene. Jackson Pollock's paintings, though seemingly aimless, don't necessarily need to aim for anything. His paintings just needed to be. Not every stroke existed for a purpose. The more important thing was that Pollock painted. He made art without thinking about why he was doing it, and the product was priceless. So as the android looks out onto the horizon, what does it set out to do? What reason does it have to live? Its reason to live is to live. Maybe it constructs more of itself, maybe it rebuilds society, maybe it writes a novel about its experience, and maybe it just watches the sunset. Whatever the case, the android makes its own purpose, forges its own path into an unknown future. And as the credits roll, the android is nowhere to be found. The issue is now being addressed directly at the player. Don't worry about what, if anything, you're meant or supposed to do. Instead, find your own reason to live. Exist for the sake of existing. Be critical and honest with yourself, your peers, and most importantly, your beliefs. Create your own purpose in life. That is not only the Talos Principle's message, but the Talos Principle itself.